Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is November 7th, 2017, and we are beginning a mini series on inappropriate interviews about sexuality with Mormon leadership. Sam Young, who is known by many in the Mormon Stories circle, he did a recent interview on Mormon Stories probably a year ago. He started a petition that has over 1,000 signatures calling on the Mormon Church to cease any interview with youth, and I would even say adults, that is inappropriate in terms of how it discusses things like masturbation and sexuality. I put out a call recently to ask people to share their stories of inappropriate interviews with bishops and mission presidents and stake presidents. And I've gotten flooded with people telling really horrific stories. And so what I want to do is just feature a bunch of those stories. They're not going to be multi-hour interviews. I'm expecting them to be shorter interviews, but each one is going to just tell different stories of Mormon church leaders asking kind of egregious, inappropriate questions in related to sexuality. So that we can help encourage the Mormon Church to stop this practice that damages so many youth. So today, for our interview, we have with us Paul VanOrden, who has courageously volunteered to be the first to tell his story. So Paul VanOrden, welcome to Mormon Stories podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
All right, so we're not going to be digging deeply into your story, but why don't we just start. Tell us just a tiny bit about your upbringing in the church, maybe before we jump into your experience with the interviews.
Born and raised in the church. My dad's side joined the church back in New York, Nauvoo time, so came across the plains. My mom's parents, one came from Germany, one came from Ireland, met at a church function. And again, my whole family on both sides, born and raised in the church. Did the whole thing growing up, 12 years old, 8 years old, baptism, raised. I went on a mission to the MTC at least, then came home. That's a whole nother story. And then, but got married in the temple, had 2 kids. And then about 8 years ago when I started my faith journey, and stepped away a year or 2 after that. And then my wife about 5 years ago, a few years after me, 3 years after me.
Okay, that gives us a background. So tell us, if you don't mind, just let's jump in and tell us your first sort of interactions with church leadership around, sexuality, masturbation, whatever your topics might be.
Yeah. So again, grew up pretty much super churchy. Didn't know much about anything besides the church in respect to alcohol, drugs, sex. Went to Churchill Junior High. I think it was about the first week of junior high. I had an interview with my bishop, and I was getting close to turning to 14, and he asked me about masturbation, and I had no idea what it was. And he didn't get too deep into it from what I remember, but the next day I asked some friends at school, like, hey, what is this? Like, what, tell me more about this. And I kind of got laughed off that, like, you didn't know what this was? You haven't done that? Oh, yeah, this is great. And you can do this. And within a few days, I'd seen my first Playboy from one of the guys at school that had it in his locker. And, I wanted to do it at that point. So I wanted to go figure it out. So in the next few days, I went and figured it out for the first time. And so that's kind of the beginning.
Real quick, Paul, can you tilt your video camera so you're kind of shown a little bit more directly? That's perfect. Yeah. So one of the first issues that you highlight is the fact that the church incessantly talking about things like masturbation and pornography, whether it's in the meetings or in these private interviews, they're so often introducing the problem that they say they're trying to stop. And so they literally are giving kids the idea to do the thing they don't want the kids to do. So that's problem one I'm hearing. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I literally had no idea what it was until I was asked about it in an interview.
Okay. And you were how old again? Around
14. I was in 7th grade, so I think I was 14.
Okay. All right. So you try it, And then how did you feel once you tried it after having the bishop ask you about it? How did it make you feel at the time?
So then it was, the next 3-4 years of my life, it was basically, I thought it was the worst thing I could do. And it was such a crutch from that point on, because every interview was about it more and more and how bad it was. And it literally was a constant fight on like how unworthy I am. I'm going to hell. This is, there's nothing I can do about this. And I would make promises back and forth and I couldn't keep them. And it just was such a big mind, can't use that word, mess with my mind.
A mind
type
fetch.
thing.
A mind
yes,
fetch.
a mind fetch.
Okay, so do you remember, after you had done it, some of the times that the bishop actually interviewed you and asked you about it? Can you talk about what those exchanges were like?
Yeah, so I remember I switched bishops kind of in the midst of this when I was probably 15, 16. I had the bishop through my mission review, and the first bishop was actually my next door neighbor, great guy, love him to death, and just ask kind of basic questions. The next one, another good guy, know his family well, still know him, but he got a little bit more detailed, like, well, how often, what do you do, how long, what are you looking at, what are you watching, do you like it, does it feel good, and then it was, after that was like, well, this is why it's bad. And I just remember the guilt trip, and I would just go home feeling so dirty and unworthy and how evil I was. And, I must be the worst person in the world. I'm the only one that can't figure this out.
So you remember feeling a lot of private guilt and shame around this?
Oh, so much. And I'd say, okay, this is the last time. I'm done with this. Like, I single-handedly blamed myself for the University of Utah losing the 1998 national championship because I masturbated the night before, right after I promised God I was never going to do it again.
Now, how did you make that connection between that and the football game?
I don't know. Thinking back on it, I just was like, hey, look, God, if I don't masturbate ever again, Utah, because I'm such a big sports fan, always have been. My family is. I fly back to Utah a couple times a year for games, but I just had this thing that, okay, if I give God this, he's going to give me the national championship, and so I single-handedly blamed us losing the national championship. I remember bawling after the game was over in my bed. This is my fault. We could have won if it wasn't for me.
Okay. So how did this guilt and shame play out in your life as you kept trying to change and you couldn't change?
So for a while, I just thought I can't change. And I kind of, I didn't really drift away from church. I still went, but it was kind of like, hey, I can never be that person that can do this and go on a mission and be worthy and get married in the temple. It was until I had a friend that said, you can just lie about that, right? And I had never put two and two together. Like, okay, and then it kind of got easier. Like, hey, if I don't tell them, then I'm not going to get the guilt trip.
Okay, so now we've found two other things. So the church introduces the idea, then it heaps this massive amount of guilt and shame on their youth or young adults or adults that causes them to feel tormented for what's very normal behavior. And then the third thing is they basically teach their youth to lie because you feel like you won't be able to go on a mission, you won't be able to get married, you won't be able to pass the sacraments, you won't be able to attend the temple if you're honest. And so your religion's basically teaching you to lie in effect because the stakes were so high. Is that right? Why would you lie? Why would you lie?
Absolutely. Yeah. The stakes were high. And even to this day, I have probably, a bunch of friends, probably 60, 70% of them straight up lied. And, they're still active today, but they lied so they could get married in the temple. So they couldn't, have that guilt of, the last second, you got to have a civil wedding because of this A, B, or C. So they lied about it, and it just created that, lying culture. I'd say, again, more than 70% of my friends weren't worthy by church standards to get married in the temple or go on their mission.
And so that's another thing where liars are rewarded, and then the ones who are honest, they're the ones who get punished.
Correct. And that again, another story, but that's the reason why I got sent home from the MTC, because I did become honest finally.
Okay, so talk about that. So you go to the MTC and what happens?
Go to MTC, called the Tonga, and so between when I got my call and when I went to the MTC was when the Higher Standards General Conference happened, if you remember that.
The raising the bar thing.
The raise the bar.
So had you lied to become a missionary then? Did you get asked that question?
So I had told everything, but not in super detail, and I had premarital sex, but it was years before. But I'd come clean and all that. But when they gave us the speech the day we got into the MTC about raising the bar, was there anything else you needed to talk to? I said, hey, I've said everything, but maybe I wasn't thorough enough with you guys. And so then they actually like kind of re-interviewed me at the MTC, sent me back to the dorm, stayed another night. Next day, they called me back and they talked to me and they said, well, we don't know about this raising the bar thing, so let's make some calls. So I sat in the office there at the MTC for 3-4 hours. Then they called me in. They had my stake president on the phone, someone from the general authorities, and then they said, well, we're just going to send you home. We're not going to release you at first, but we're just going to send you home, and then we'll figure out what to do. And then I went home, met with the bishop, met with stake president.
And they sent you home for which thing?
For kind of culminating everything, but more the premarital sex that I'd had it only with one person, but more than a couple times.
What were the issues?
Again, masturbation, and then premarital sex that I confessed to it before I went, but that I had it for a period of time, more than just a few times or whatever. I had a girlfriend, and it'd been a long-term thing, and I confessed to it, but just not how much I did it. And they asked every question: how many times did I orgasm? I mean, it was the craziest interview.
What details did they ask? Tell all the details they asked. So
yeah, I mean, so they asked. I remember talking to the stake president. They said, "Did you orgasm? Did I lose you?
No, you're there.
Oh, there you are. Did you? How many times did you orgasm? Did you orgasm inside of her? How often? All these questions." And so then they decided to send me home for a few days. Went home and then they released me normally. And then I got a letter saying that due to the new church standards and raising the bar, we don't feel you're fit to serve a mission in this standard. We'd like you to serve in other ways. If you'd like to reapply in a year's time, feel free to do so. Talk to your stake president.
What's it like to get sent home early from your mission? What does that do?
So it's kind of interesting. My oldest brother came home from his mission for anxiety reason, and he took it really hard. It pushed him away from the church. I have a different personality. Like, I mean, I don't get offended. I don't give, like, I'll go to church and say he came home, I'll flip him the bird for all I care. So it didn't bother me as much. Like, I had seen it in it, but it caused my parents, and especially my dad, like a lot of shame. Like, oh, I had one kid come home and now another. It hurt him to the core.
So you're saying you didn't mind so much?
Again, in my personality, I just brush stuff off, so it really didn't bother me.
Did you remain active in the church after that?
Yeah, I was dating my girlfriend, not the person I had premarital sex with, and she was active. And again, we ended up getting married in the temple about 2.5 years later. But for a time, her parents banned her from seeing me. I could only write for her, is what they said, for the next 2 years since I came home from my mission. But she finally pushed through that, and we worked it out. And her parents, in about 3-4 months, finally let me see her again, and we ended up getting married, like I said, about 2 years down the road after that in the temple.
Okay. Any other experiences with church leadership around, talking about sexuality?
Same thing, my bishop, I just remember, and again, looking back, it just seems so weird. I remember the first time I confessed that I had premarital sex, and he was like, well, it feels good, right? That was his first response. And I was like, what? And then he went into more detail, and it just seemed normal at the time from the way I was groomed, but just some of the, like, I can't imagine an adult asking my daughter that, having a daughter now, and one of the stranger interviews I had is before my mission, I met with my stake president, and we were talking, I confessed, he knew about all this stuff, and he asked if I had oral sex as well, and I said yes, and he said, can you imagine Jesus having oral sex? And I just, whoa, kind of like, I don't imagine Jesus having sex until now. And it was really an odd question. And and he's like, because it's not of God. That's why you can't picture it. And in or out of marriage, oral sex is against the church, and you can't do that. Oh, okay. I'd never heard that before. And so like, oh, geez, that was different. And I went back to my boss at work, who was my mentor, one of my best friends, like a second dad figure. The next day I went to him and he's like, "Oh, how'd it go?" He's a huge TBM, still super active. I talk to him all the time, but he goes, "Oh, how'd it go? Everything go good?" And I was like, he told me you can have oral sex even after you get married. And he's kind of more casual. He just kind of laughs. So I was like, well, I've never heard that. If that's true, I'm screwed because my wife likes that more than normal sex. And so that at least eased me a little bit. Like, okay, I'm not a complete horrible human being, because this guy who's my mentor and super churchy, he's okay with it.
And this highlights a couple more of the problems. Number one is these leaders aren't trained to talk about sexuality with adults, let alone children. And then also you get such a wide variety of not only, advice and perspectives, but also punishments. Some bishops and stake presidents will say it's okay to masturbate, or we won't punish you. Other ones are going to take away your temple recommend, not let you take the sacrament for 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my best friends, he was at a BYU game in Arizona. He was driving back, and he, with his fiance, got a blowjob from his fiance in the car ride. They both went and told their bishops the next Sunday. Her bishop made her not take the sacrament for 6 weeks. He was the elders quorum president. The bishop said, "Don't take it today, but I know you feel bad, so you're good after that."
Yeah, you get it's called leadership roulette, but you get such a variation. We have a listener named Michael who says, "I've been in the church for 30 years. I can't remember a time when I was ever asked directly about masturbation in a worthiness interview." And Michael, I think you're just illustrating our point that there's such variety. Sometimes people get asked deeply graphic, offensive, inappropriate questions as young as 12 years old. And then there are other church leaders who will never do it. But Michael, I hope you're not insinuating that because you had that experience that everyone else is lying who has. And I tell you, I have over 100 people who have reached out to me to tell me their stories, and they're graphic. We have bishops and stake presidents asking women, did they orgasm? What did it feel like? What sexual positions? Was there oral? Was there anal? Was there finger penetration? Was there penile penetration? The level of graphicness that I have been receiving from the people who have emailed me is revolting. So, Michael, I hope you're not insinuating that just because you had that experience, that other people haven't had the experience that they claim. Paul, anything else you want to share about your experiences?
No, just like on that same point, I remember very detailed interviews, like when I was probably 16, 17, when I touched a girl's boobs. Was it over the clothes? Was it under the clothes? Did you do that? I mean, it was super detailed always from the age of 15 to 19. It was literally reliving the situation in every detail with that bishop. What'd you do? How'd you like it? Over the clothes, under the clothes? Were your clothes on? Did you dry hump? Did you do it with your clothes on? I mean, in my case, it was always about as detailed it could be after the age of 15 with that bishop.
And what do you think is wrong with a leader asking a youth or a young adult or even an adult that level of sort of graphic questions?
I think there's a lot of wrong with it, especially with a child. These are untrained professionals. And like I said, looking back, like I have a 11-year-old daughter now. Thank God we're not in the church, but she'd be turning 12 in January. And if she came home, and even my wife said she wasn't ever asked these questions until our marriage interview. So good for her bishops and stake presidents that she wasn't asked these questions. But I mean, if my daughter got asked that by a male, 45-year-old male in a closed door room and was asking those questions, that is, that's sexual assault in my opinion.
Yeah. Joe writes, I was asked many times pre-mission and post-mission about it. Even during my mission, I was even asked about it after I was married. Rick writes, my stake president had the talk with our Aaronic priesthood group. He brought an actual pistol and played Russian roulette, saying that masturbation was the same thing as Russian roulette. So just some feedback from our listeners. Really quickly, Paul, to close your story, were there any serious or significant short, medium, or long-term effects to these experiences as a child and as a young adult?
Yeah.
What's the harm? What's been the harm to you?
For so many years, the guilt and conditioning, like when I would do it, and when I was first married and went through the temple, when we're married, and then I'd look at some type of porn and masturbate, and hide it from your wife. And you just felt so guilty, and just sexuality there's such a guilt placed on it that it was kind of hard on like your marriage and sex life until you break away from that. Like it's just, there was so much guilt. And I'm sure you see women, I've had women friends that have divorced men because of it. They can't figure it out. It's just this guilt. And even though I've been away from the church for 8 years, like they're still always in this back of the head. And it doesn't have to be just sexuality, masturbation, but anything that's against the church. Even when I have a drink or, you just think, for so long I was conditioned that this is like one of the worst things you can do. And it's still there, even though I blow it off nowadays, but it's still always in the back of my head. Like I was conditioned so bad that this was so wrong.
Yeah. And would you say that the church, the way they deal with it, actually makes it more likely that you're going to do, these sorts of behaviors, look at pornography, masturbate?
Oh, 100%. Oh yeah.
How does the church's treatment of this issue actually make it more likely or more common?
Yeah, absolutely. It's there's a national park down towards Zion, and there's this bark that's there, and they put up a sign that said, "Don't take the bark," because it was this rare bark. And as soon as they put up that sign, the bark started going faster than ever. And it's kind of the same thing to me, as they create this thing as, well, do you do this? This is bad. This is so bad. Don't do it. And if you don't know what it is, you're going to go look and find out what it is that's so bad. And you want to see and you want to feel and touch something that's forbidden. It just creates that mindset to try to figure out what it is.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of like, don't look behind the door. You're gonna make them look behind the door. Matthew writes, I was asked many times and many details. I did not even know what masturbation was until my bishop asked if I did it at age 11. So Matthew was asked at age 11. What's that, Paul?
That's scary. Age 11. I mean, I just can't even imagine my daughter at age 11, my son that's 9 now, they have no clue what that kind of stuff is.
Yeah. Joey writes, as a missionary, I was teaching a 12-year-old less active family. We were trying to prepare him for the priesthood. In one of our lessons, the person was with us repeatedly mentioned that in interviewing him for the priesthood, the bishop would ask about masturbation. I was floored by the mention, as was my companion. We didn't know how to respond, react, or redirect. That's another problem, is there's just not a standard treatment with the church. And so any old person, any old leader can kind of do or say whatever they want with males or females at almost any age. And it's just sort of an egregious wild west of inappropriate sort of questions to people.
Yeah. And there's no training, you got, like you said, rogue people that ask different way, different punishments, different things. And there's no formal training whatsoever on what questions to ask. It says, ask this and then take it from there. And you're going to get some creepers that take it extremely bad. And you're going to get people like Sam Young who never even thought of asking it.
Yeah. All right, Paul, any final words you want to say before we sort of wrap up your interview?
No, I think you got it all.
All right, Paul, well, I just want to thank you so much for your willingness to be the first to tell your story. It takes people willing to be courageous and to share difficult things to make things change. Our goal is along with Sam Young, to get the church to create policies that change this activity, that stop this behavior, and that basically stop the church from asking youth, children, and even adults inappropriate questions around sexuality that actually do more harm than good. So big thanks to Sam Young for his help. Big thanks to you, Paul, for your willingness. And if any of our listeners want to share their stories, we would love to interview as well for Mormon Stories podcast. All right, Paul, thanks so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's November 8th, 2017. We're broadcasting, streaming live from Holiday, Utah, and we're very excited to begin part 2 of our multi-part series on inappropriate interviews regarding sexuality with Mormon leaders. And today we're going to be interviewing Ann Payne. Now, Ann is not her real name, but as you can imagine, there are often risks to both being interviewed by Mormon Stories, but also talking about things that are so sensitive. So we're interviewing Anne, but Anne's not her real name. And we're really excited to have people joining us through Facebook Live. We want to invite folks to participate, share comments, questions, concerns, feedback interactively on Facebook, because that makes these interviews more interesting. So without any further ado, Anne Payne, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks. I'm pretty excited to be here.
Under the circumstances.
A little nervous, but.
All right. So Anne, why don't we begin? Just give us like a 1-minute summary of your experience in the church prior to the interviews. You don't have to tell us about where you are now. Let's just focus on kind of a tiny bit of your background. So that
I grew up in the church in Canada. Okay. And I've been fairly active most of my life. My activity and my views on Mormonism have been changing for probably about 7 years now. And I'm an avid Mormon Stories listener. I'm pretty happy to be on the podcast. I stick around with Mormonism in the hopes that the good that it has brought me can outshine the things that are hard for me.
So you're still attending?
I do. Mm-hmm.
That is super cool. I'm really happy to have attending members whenever we can get them.
I think I'm probably one of the most active people in my family, but my ward might consider me less active. I now live in Utah County, so I'm in a weird place. But yeah.
Well, we're glad you're joining us. Okay, so why don't you just begin by telling us when matters of sexuality started coming up for you as a Mormon child or youth, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I think I'll start by talking about the interview that didn't happen. When I was very young, really young, preschool age, I was repeatedly molested by a male babysitter who was LDS. And it was a repeated thing. And I don't think I told anyone about it because I was so little, but it's, quite imprinted on me. And as the years went on, it turns out, I found out years and years later, well, this kid showed up when I was about 12 or 13 at our house with his parents, because they were good family friends of my family, even though we hadn't seen him for a while. And apparently he was like on his way on a mission or something. And I was like, why is this dude here? I knew who he was. I still remember him. And years later, in my adulthood, I became aware that the bishop actually knew what had happened, and actually my father knew about it as well. And they just decided not to ever address it. They decided that it was so much time had passed and I was so young and it didn't matter. And so he got to merrily go on his mission, and no interaction happened with me. And that was a pretty, those sorts of things affect you most of your life, I think. And in my adulthood, when I realized how I was overlooked and discounted in something so formative for me, that was a pretty hard blow. So that is something.
So you feel like you were abused, and the church didn't feel like you were important enough to even make that right.
Or to talk. Yeah, that I looked fine as a preteen kid. I must be fine. And I think that story is fairly common based on my internet searching, whatever.
I'm so sorry that happened.
When I was 12, I went for my bishop's interview, as you do when you're 12. And I was just, I was a chubby, prepubescent, like super long pigtails, chubby shirt, and it was the 80s. So, I just rode my bike across town to the interview. I remember I fell on my bike on the way there, and I had a big scrape on my knee. So I get into the interview, and it's the summer, and I'm sweaty. I have these pigtails and like my chubby 12-year-old tummies. I'm just a little girl. I remember my cut on my knee. I had like a little piece of toilet paper there I put so it wouldn't bleed, but it was dripping down my knee. And so I am just a kid, this little kid. And I remember going to that interview. I mean, I hadn't even started reading Judy Blume books yet. I was really just a little kid. And this dude, this bishop, I mean, he started talking to me about masturbation and what it was and what it entailed. And I even remember him using the word orgasm, and I didn't really know what that was even. And that is probably the most inappropriate. I mean, it felt weird at the time, but you know, when you're that age, you don't process these things real.
How do they bring it up with the 12-year-old girl? Like, how does?
Well, I don't know. Because I had not heard of it before. I remember when I started reading Judy Blume books, I was like, oh, that's what he was talking about. And so, of course, I just tried it. So
Judy Blume talks about masturbation?
Yeah, the author, Judy Blume. Yeah,
I didn't know she would have talked about that in her books.
She does, yeah. I mean, I think it was Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I mean, I love Judy Blume. She was a great author when I was little.
Okay, so do you remember what it was like to have him asking you about that as a 12-year-old girl?
It was weird. I was sitting there. I remember sitting. I mean, it's just imprint. I was sitting there and looking down at my tummy pudging out and looking at my knee where the thing was still bleeding. And I was like, I didn't know what to say. I was just being talked at about this topic that I didn't know anything about and that didn't feel right.
Okay.
And I remember it so specifically, and I am just appalled. I have kids now, and I mean, the first thing I did when we moved to our new ward is I meet with the bishop and I say, you do not have permission to speak to my kids about sexual things. You may not mention the word masturbation or refer to it. And that kind of gets me blacklisted, I guess, but it's so wrong. I feel like these things, my life as a teenager, as a young adult, I think I had pretty average sexual experimentation for a regular kid. And for a Mormon kid who was super active and went to EFY and it was all personal progress to the max, it was pretty negative, obviously. I think my history played into it and family of origin stuff. That revolving door through the bishop's office over and over, all of these things lead up to, none of my subsequent bishops were ever inappropriate. I mean, they did ask me about sexuality and I confessed and cried and then blah, blah, blah.
And did the bishop give you the idea about masturbation by talking about it?
Yes. In fact, I went home and tried it. And then he did.
So again, they're introducing the problem that they present themselves as desiring to solve.
Introduced the concept to me, and I personally don't feel like that is a problem, but the church obviously does.
Well, actually, we don't know. I guess the Strength of the Youth pamphlet says don't arouse your passions, but at the same time, it doesn't mention masturbation specifically. And there are lots of bishops that don't even ask about it. So part of the problem is this wide variability of latitude, right?
Yeah.
But the point is that you started trying masturbation as a young girl after the bishop gave you the idea.
That's accurate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So talk about how this progressed.
Maybe I should just thank him. I don't know. The point is that my sexuality as a member of the church has never been my own. When some middle-aged man introduces something like that to me, it's not mine. And when I'm accountable to these people, I feel like, and of course, the history of sexual abuse and the revolving bishopric door, it's never been my own. It's been something that belonged to other people that I had to report to. All the problems in the way young women teach about sexuality, it's save for your husband. I think becoming an actualized woman claiming my own sexuality has been a process that was greatly impeded and negatively affected by my interaction with male leaders to whom I felt accountable for that part of my life.
Sure. So did you have any other experiences with the church in regards to sexuality? You said there
Um,
was a revolving door. Were
just
you
as I
caught in that cycle
yeah,
of
I mean, I was
confession
a
and
fairly sexually explorative youth and young adult for Mormon standards, and so I'd have some encounters, and then I'd go talk to the bishop, and then I have some encounters, go talk to the bishop. The thing that I realized over the decades is that my sexual exploration, a lot of it stemmed from the abuse as a child, and I mean, family of origin, which I don't want to get into that especially, but there was never a bishop who understood that I needed some help. They would help me make a big resolve to never do this again. But there was never anyone who understood the part of me that was broken. And they were the only person I knew to go to. When I finally, I went to BYU and I found a counselor at BYU. She was a miracle worker and really helped me start to work on recovering from my past.
when you say you were broken, what do you mean?
I think the early sexual abuse, really repeated sexual molestation, is just breaks a part of you inside, and that was my experience. And so I was bringing that to my sexual experiences as a young adult without really knowing, and going to bishops for help, feeling like I was, what's the word? I was inadequate. I was the licked cupcake. I was a chewed piece of gum. Help me be better. And thankfully, my bishops, as a young adult and as a teenager, they were all good people, and they weren't abusive in any way to me or inappropriate. But at the same time, they didn't recognize that I needed help. Even when I shared my past with them, it was never something that, it was always something like, I have to repent, I have to change, I have to sing primary song when I feel sexual, and I have to never watch an R-rated movie and never wear a tank top, and I have to do this. Whereas it was a trained mental health provider who helped me address what the parts of my heart that really needed help. It wasn't the bishops, and the guilt and the self-loathing and the I don't know, the guilt, I guess, with that revolving door is really heavy to carry. And it's unfortunate that they didn't recognize that they did not have the tools to help, to truly help, and that they should have helped me find someone. They were the only person I knew to go to for this thing that was wrong with me.
So if I were to maybe summarize what I've heard so far, when you experience severe, significant sexual abuse, they were nowhere to be found in terms of either righting the wrong, punishing the offender, or providing you with the help and support you needed. So that was problem one, right?
Yeah.
Then problem two is they introduced you to the problem that they then were punishing you for, which was masturbation, in a very age inappropriate way.
Mm-hmm.
That's the second thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're sitting there as an adolescent, broken around being a PTSD survivor of sexual abuse and assault. And you're stuck in this, and you're hearing all these shame-based messages around your worth and your value and your sinful nature. So you're caught in this sort of violent, emotionally violent revolving door of feeling broken, of having this trauma, of being a normal kid involved in normal sexual exploration and experiences. And you're sort of put in this punishing revolving door of guilt and shame and confession and trying to do better. And fortunately, you had leaders that weren't abusive or horrible, but
Yeah.
that's still, it sounds like that was still a very punishing experience for you.
Had they been abusive or horrible, I probably would have been more aware that I needed something else, which I don't, do you know what I mean? Because they were so good to me and loving. You know, I had really good bishops at BYU that didn't kick me out.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, you know, I guess they could have kicked me out.
Yeah, they could have been worse, but
And
in some ways, them being nice
they
probably
didn't even they didn't understand how the system and even their loving approach was actually really damning for me.
Because it kept you trapped in the system where you're continually punished.
Yeah.
And then the last things I'm hearing you say is they're ill-trained, they're not trained, they're not skilled at dealing with these issues. So them even trying is sort of irresponsible and ethically irresponsible. And
Yes.
then they clearly didn't get you the support you needed either. So not only were they ill-equipped and it was wrong for them to even be listening to this sort of thing, they didn't refer you to the help and the support, the clinical help and the support that you needed.
Yes.
Anything else we're missing from your story that you would want to share?
I've really loved the, you know, I found people like Jennifer Finlayson Fife and Natasha Helfer Parker. I found them through you and through, and they've just been, that sort of thing has been revolutionary for me in owning and claiming the power, the sexuality that's mine, that belongs to no one, to whom I am accountable for. I'm only accountable to myself. And for embracing that, I think that females recognizing and claiming power in any regard, especially sexually, is pretty detrimental to a patriarchal system. And I sometimes think that this system is perpetuated because of the way that it keeps females on a box, on a pedestal, in a place that they can be controlled. And I think the sexual nature of it is core to finding power and claiming true agency, which I believe is a fundamental gift from Heavenly Parents, and fundamentally Mormon, but not something really sought after truly in the patriarchal system that we have. But I just am so grateful for the sources I've found through, you know, through your organization that have really helped me. And also a really good therapist. I'm a great therapist. So.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So shout out to Jennifer Finlayson Fife, to Natasha Helfer Parker, to all the clinicians out there that are making themselves available to not just treat women and abuse survivors and survivors of the church's damaging messages, not just to sort of treat them as, you know, clinical solutions to solve, but to empower you, to give you your own autonomy, to let you know that your sexual experiences are yours and that sex is something for you to own and to enjoy. That is such important messaging.
Yeah. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. This has been a really powerful, these are shorter. My staff was really surprised that I did like a 20-minute interview or a 30-minute interview, because normally I do 6 hours, but yeah, these are shorter, but we've gotten a lot of feedback from listeners. So I'm just going to read a few comments. Is that okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Diane writes, John writes, "I'm so sorry. People are very touched by your story." Diane writes, "Sounds familiar about how the men or boys are forgiven and the women or the girls are blamed." Diane says she's not a member anymore, but her religion is love. And I have heard that in several interviews. let's just say there's a couple that's engaged to get married or whatever, oftentimes the female gets a much harsher punishment than the male.
Oh yeah.
And instances of abusers just being let off the hook seem to be rampant within Mormonism. Any comments on that, Anne?
I know of several stories that are similar, even worse abuse. I remember as a BYU student, I had been fooling around with some kid, and he was a return missionary, and I remember feeling so just like it was my fault, and here's this priesthood holder, and look what I made him do, and look how I have corrupted him, and just really taking that on myself. Really just instinctively, the first thought was, here's this servant of the Lord who is returned and who has the priesthood, and here am I, who just can't seem to get out of this rut, and I'm just tarnishing him. And I remember just saying, I can never see you again, and he was like, oh, why? And I remember just internalizing that and feeling so culpable for not only my personal, I don't know what the word is, whatever, but also for making him like me.
Right. And so even amongst the children and youth, a disproportionate percent of the burden of just sexual experimentation within Mormonism, not just modesty, but also the sexual exploration, seems to fall on the girl,
Yeah.
the woman, and that's
that was
also
just ingrained into me that,
yeah. That's a great point. Kelly says, she says something is listed as specific sin in the miracle of forgiveness. I'm guessing she means masturbation. Was miracle forgiveness part of your repentance process? And if so, what was that like?
I think in high school I was supposed to read some of it, and you know how high school kids are.
Okay.
So I remember reading a little bit about his view of women in the workplace, and I was like, whatever, this is not for me. I just, I've always been a feminist in my heart from the time I was pretty young, and when I read that, I was like, this obviously isn't for me. So it wasn't a real big influence.
You dodged that bullet.
Yeah, thank goodness.
Kelly writes that the bishops are not trained. That's absolutely true. We brag that we have a unpaid clergy. Many people argue that they would rather have a paid clergy where they were trained and professionals at what they do, instead of just winging it at nights and on weekends without any training and actual competence. So I don't know that we should always brag as a church that our clergy is untrained and unpaid. I think they should be paid and they should be trained.
I think they should be trained, and there should be men and women who are trained. Women,
right?
Mm-hmm. I still don't think that sexual probing and talking about masturbation is good for either gender to pursue with kids, but or with adults. But if there are matters of sexuality or personal things that you do want to talk with someone about, I think that having a trained person of either gender would be really nice.
So if the church is going to talk about sexuality with young girls, have a woman do it, not a man. Yeah, love that. Larry writes, so much damage done from well-meaning but completely incompetent bishops. Vanessa writes, love hearing from this amazing woman. I agree. You are amazing, Anne. Vanessa says she knows you. Mm-hmm. She says, this is powerful and heartbreaking. Huge problem in the Mormon church is that we never get to own our sexuality and to feel enormous shame over normal sexuality. Love from Spokane. So that's Vanessa. Do you want to shout out to Melissa?
Vanessa. Thanks. I love you.
Melissa writes, I was sexually abused as a child and I never told anyone because I felt like it was my fault. Add to this being given a copy of that talk by McKay at 12, and I thought I was not redeemable because I had not fought even unto death. I don't know what she's talking about, but apparently there's some article where
it's better to fight unto death than to be sexually abused. I have a friend who has a story in her genealogy from the Mormon colonies of her great abuela or whatever, who Pancho Villa came and they were storming and blah, blah, blah. The story is that he was going to rape her as a child, but her mother said, I will kill her here before I let you take her virtue. And I remember this woman, my friend, telling the story to the young women, and I was like, wait a minute, what does that teach us about sexual assault survivors? What does that say about me? You know, those sorts of stories are pretty damaging. It reminds me of, yeah, it's better to fight to the death than to allow yourself to be deflowered or whatever.
Yeah, super damaging stuff. And I'm grateful for Elizabeth Smart, who's been coming out lately and talking about that stuff.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that affected her. So let's drop that idea that someone's worth is tied to any sexual experience they've had in any way, right?
Yeah.
Amy writes, in general, this is all very abusive. I think we agree, Amy. That's why we're doing it. Jenna wants to know if you talked about the abuse, and your abuse. I think you've not chosen to talk about details about that, and I don't even want to go there unless you want to.
I talked about that I was repeatedly molested as a very young child by an LDS male babysitter. So that's all I want to say about that.
That's fine. I don't want to dig there. David writes, one of the problems is that bishops are called and expected to fulfill their role without any or very little training. Often their training is from what they observed bishops doing when they were youth. That's so true. Is people ask how, like I've heard about people where the bishop like asks a young woman to text him every day to let him know if she masturbated or not. That is a totally awful thing to do. But
so
bishops
can masturbate thinking about it, like seriously?
but also I think bishops learn from other bishops, and it's what was done to them. And so there's this weird verbal unwritten order of things that gets passed down from bishop to bishop or from stake president to bishop. And they need to codify this in some type of manual so that there are standards and rules and guidelines that are explicit, because letting bishops sort of shoot from the hip is causing all sorts of damage, right?
I don't understand. I'm fairly new to Utah, and there's such strict regulations on what you can teach about sexuality in the schools that people as a culture, as a whole, the Mormon people don't want anyone teaching their kids about sexuality outside of the family, but yet we send our kids into these closed offices where the main topic is sexuality, and you have no idea what's being said or what the experience of the person is. There's no curriculum. And it's such a juxtaposition to see this, don't tell my kids about anything, don't say anything, except go ahead and ask them how often they touch themselves and who they kiss and where they got. It makes no sense to me.
And there's no discussion about consent and what consent is and how to give it and how, to respect it and when consent is even possible versus not. The Unitarian Universalists have like a nationally, internationally acclaimed curriculum to talk about sexuality with their youth. And the church needs to sort of enter the 21st century and come up with a curriculum.
The Boy Scouts require some kind of sexual predator training for youth and kids every single year, which I applaud and I want my boy to go to. Where is that for the young women? Why don't our young women trainer people get that? Why don't our young women have an official lessons like unto what the Scouts receive every year about bodies and permission and consent? I mean, that's because the Boy Scouts of America has that standard. The church has to do it, but there's nothing equal in the Young Women's Program for the leaders or for the girls. And
the church needs to get serious about this. Joyce writes, patriarchy is damaging to everyone. We agree, Joyce. TC writes, I grew up in the Presbyterian tradition and my church would have handled this the same way, blame or fix the victim.
Yeah, I bet that's true. I'd be interested to know about that, but I bet that's true.
Let's see. Ryan says sexual education has no place in the bishop's office. I think that's,
amen.
I love that. TC writes, unpaid clergy can avoid accountability for the otherwise professional opinions they're asked to provide. That's a really interesting thing, that maybe Curtin and McConkie wants the clergy unpaid and untrained because then the church is less liable, I guess, in lawsuits. That's really distorted. Tom writes, when I suggested the women's leaders in the ward handle the yearly interview with the young women, you'd think I'd suggested killing puppies during the sacrament.
Yeah.
So, yeah, why is it just disgusting or outrageous to a Mormon male leader to have women having these conversations with girls?
Because then the women might figure out their power.
Yeah, this is where patriarchy is just corrosive on every
There's
level.
so much power and control in having someone be sexually accountable. And I think that, you know, the vows you make in the temple are pretty explicitly female follows male, female bows to male. I don't think that giving women that kind of power falls in line with patriarchy, and I think patriarchy in general is scared of that kind of power and agency that comes from females.
John writes, it's about control and dominance. And I don't think intentionally, but maybe subconsciously, that's exactly what it's about. Jennifer says she's asked these questions to a bishop even as recently as a week ago. And I think that's great. Those who are in the church, please wield your influence to try and make the church experience safer for our youth. Whatever way you can speak up, whatever way you can influence it, I think that's really powerful. All right, well, we've had great participation. We have over 100 people joining us, and I expected you to be brilliant, but you were even more brilliant than I expected. Any final thoughts or comments or recommendations you have for the church or its leaders as you close your very important story?
Oh, I have a lot of recommendations for the church, but none of them matter really. But I am pretty adamant that I speak to every single counselor or bishop who requests an interview with my kids, that they do not talk about masturbation. And every time there's an interview, I approach them, they have to contact me first. And I say, you may not discuss masturbation, you may not approach specific sexuality. I consider that abusive. I'm the custodial parent, and I consider that to be sexual abuse. And FYI, that provides kind of a black mark on your record. You get blacklisted, and no one asked you to speak at church if you do that. But I feel like that's a step I can take to help my kids, since we're still here. We're still Mormon, more or less, and that's
so parents protect your kids is rule number one.
Advocate for them.
Yeah.
Regardless of the social cost. And I ask the topic of every fireside. My kids don't do those much anyway, but any bishop's fireside or inquire about the topics, find out what they're teaching. If you're going to participate in LDS, things like that, be well informed about what's happening.
Love it.
Really nice and not like assertive like I am. You could probably become a leader and influence even more, but assertive people, women like me, don't usually get to be in influential positions.
Right.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's to the church's loss. All right. Anything else you want to share?
You asked me. I'm just so honored. And I think you're doing really good work, and I appreciate everything you do.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's have you back.
My story is common, and speaking out is a really powerful tool, no matter how scary it is.
Well, you're brilliant and so gracious. So thank you.
Thanks, John.